Today we have Professor Christian Bergqvist.
Yes.
Yeah, Christian Bergqvist. He is a assistant professor at the University of Copenhagen, and he is, of course, specialized in competition law, and also he is a senior fellow at the George Washington Competition and Innovation Lab at the George Washington University. And he also has a extensive experience in practicing competition law.
Yes.
And business law. Okay. Today we have the privilege of having here Christian. So the floor is yours.
Thank you for hosting me and giving me an excuse to come to talk to you that I'm very happy about. Now, what I will do is that I have been I've had an interest in Google and Google's clashes with competition law for the last 10 years, and during that time I've sort of been collecting whenever there was a blog or a news flash or an article outlining a competition law case. I printed it and put it on file. And last year, I started actually consolidating it to see if there was some interesting pattern. And there are some very interesting patterns with respect to Google's antitrust trouble, which I will outline today. It's based on a paper. I'll have a reference for it at the end. And that paper is a preliminary paper, but I plan to turn it into an academic paper with footnotes. And I'm very happy to take comments, etc. Now, there are many things about Google that are really fascinating. I think the most interesting thing is that if we go back, why is it not a... No, okay. If we go back 25 years, nobody had heard about Google because Google wasn't, it was founded in 1998, which is 26 years ago. If you go back 20 years, Google was actually viewed very favorable.
It's smaller, the small windows.
Yeah. Google was actually viewed very favorable because at that time, the big bad wolf was Microsoft, and Google challenged Microsoft's monopoly when it comes to search. So 20 years ago, Google was actually viewed really positive. And it wasn't until 10, 15 years ago, the narrative started changing. So we have a company that has moved from being universally loved to be universally hated. And the number of antitrust investigations are literally exploding globally. Now, I have been able to identify 110 cases. I normally just write 100 because I think some of them are actually not two cases, it's one. So I'm still in the process of verifying, but I'm tracking 110 cases, and I got an email yesterday. So I might actually have 111 cases, but I just say 100 cases in 23 different jurisdictions. So we can talk about a company that are facing antitrust issue literally globally, including in Japan. Now, what was interesting is that based on my mapping, it looks like 86% of all of these cases, open, closed, somewhere in the process, pertains essentially to 8 services. Now, all of these, of course, create a very negative narrative regarding Google, but in my opinion, only 2 of them should really trouble Google. And what's interesting, it looks like most enforcers has not identified that. So, if there's any enforcer listening in, I have a couple of advice for you here. Now, I think most of you have a pretty good idea what Google do. But what you might not know is that it is actually just not one product. It is, as far as I can see, 271 services and products. I don't know if that is the exact figure. The way I figured out was I Googled it. And if you Google how many services are Google offering, I got 271. They might have added a couple since the last time I checked, but 271 different kind of services. Most of them are free. And I think most of you probably rely on a couple of them, and you probably also love them. Personally, I love Google Maps. I love YouTube because, whenever I go to a country when there's nothing on the television that I understand, I watch a lot of YouTube. Google Maps allows me to get to the right place. So a lot of the Google service is something we love. Some of you might have a Google Mail, but I'm quite convinced that you have a pretty good idea about a lot of these. So Google is offering an ecosystem that are free, and actually it's not free because you pay with your privacy, but you don't pay for it. So it is offered at the price of 0. Now, the way Google finance all of this, essentially they're selling ads, and approximately 75% of Google's income comes from ads. And there are essentially 2 ways of selling ads. Either you have sponsored links or you sell ads on a publisher. So you go to a domain address, this is a Danish newspaper, it's in English, and there you will see some ads. Or you are on YouTube, you search for something, you get sponsored link, you have the blue organic links, and you have some sponsored links up here. So that is essentially how Google is selling ads. And this is how they pay or finance this large free ecosystem. Now, Google is not only selling ads, but they are also the biggest buyer. And that is probably the biggest buyer, and that is YouTube. I assume most of you know what YouTube is. They have a lot of video for free. And you essentially accept seeing some ads when you go to YouTube and see a video. And some of you might also produce videos. I did that myself. I have my own video channel, the Antitrust channel, where I produce small videos. And as you can see up here, I have 900 and 192 subscribers. So I wouldn't call myself a media personality and a YouTuber, but I actually think it's quite funny to do small videos. I mostly do that to my students, but I also from time to time produce some video that is targeting a more broad audience. Now, all of this free services is financed by ads, because there's no such thing as a free lunch. So the way you essentially pay that, you give up some privacy, in exchange you get a free ecosystem. That is a model all tech companies utilize, but none does it intensely as Google and Meta. But I will limit myself to talk about Google today. Now, the problem is that Google's success comes at the expense of traditional advertisers. We can see that more and more advertisement revenue is made online, and that means that traditional publishers can no longer make the same handsome business case based on selling ads, because the ads becomes digital and they are progressively moved in the direction of Google and to a lesser extent Meta. Now, the biggest victim of this are what we call newspaper, traditional media, magazine and newspaper. They're really struggling to make a business case based on ads because people are progressively relying on online ads. So Google's success comes at the expense of traditional media. Now, the victims of Google actions are not confined to traditional media. It's also vertical competitors, other providers of maps, other providers of shopping, other providers of activity information services. So Google engaged in self-favoring to make the system more attractive, and as I'll explain later, to protect the core product, which comes at the expense not only of traditional media, but also a number of competitors on a downstream market. Now, Google has a very successful business case. You can see not only how the revenue keeps climbing, but the other picture is from when I visited Google a couple of years ago. I saw a lot of Porsches and very expensive cars. So you not only are the shareholder rewarded handsomely for being a shareholder, so are the employees. In my opinion, they're probably overpaying some of the employees, but that's not really of my concern. I'm not a shareholder. I just make an observation. And yes, I can see from your face that you agree with me. A Porsche cannot be green. It can be black, it can be red. Anything else is distasteful. Now, but Google is also a company who are confronted with troubles. And the first problem they have is actually this gentleman. He's dead, but he did not invent the smartphone, but he really made it popular. 2007, they introduced the smartphone, and that changed the game completely. Up until that point, if you want to go online and look for anything on the internet, you would do it using a stationary PC. So, stationary PC as the entry point for the internet was 100%. But going forward, we can see how the user's way of access to the internet has changed completely. As of 2015, approximately half of all internet searches start online. So that means that whenever you look for anything online, you are statistically more likely to do it using a smartphone than a computer. You can ask yourself, is that true? Is that the way I use it? Statistically, it is. I have not found figures that are more recently 2016, but I understand it only goes one direction. And that means that Google at that time was the gatekeeper to the internet, but this could open an opportunity for somebody else to dethrone them, just like they early had dethroned Microsoft. We call that the first browser war, that was Microsoft. The second browser war was, of course, when Google dethroned Microsoft. And this is, in my opinion, the third browser war. You probably never heard about it, and I'll explain why you didn't do that in a couple of minutes. This is the first problem. Now, the second problem Google has is that the entire way we access the internet is changing. Now, traditionally, we would use a search engine, and then I would look for, how do I get to Tokyo? Well, I would probably have gone to some kind of map service that would tell me a lot about Tokyo, including that it has 2 airports. I no longer need to do that. I can make a very smart search where I essentially ask Google, how many airports does Tokyo have? I have not tested, but I'm quite convinced it probably is a voice assistant that I can speak to, Siri or Alexa, and I can ask them a vocal question, and then they will actually provide an answer. I have not tested it, but I've seen others do it. So rather than doing a traditional way of searching where I would go to a page, AI is actually changing the way we search for information on the internet. Now, please pay attention. These 2 challenges is something that could destroy Google. And I know that they are aware of them. Why do I know that? That's because they've actually taken actions to prevent it. Now, before I explain what Google have done to counter this risk, we need to understand that all companies, all product is confronted with a life circus. You have a product who are incepted, it grows, and then suddenly it disappears. I've been working a lot with the postal sector, and traditional letter is a business that has been around, for the last couple of thousand years. But going forward, it is disappearing. Nobody sends letters anymore. I don't know about Japan, but at least that is the situation in Europe. I have always had a tradition of sending a postcard to my mom, but it is becoming progressively more complicated to do that because in a lot of countries, they don't even have postcards anymore. So it has taken many thousand years before the letter business has died, but it's happening. Now, if we turn to online, we literally see how company emerge and disappear. I actually remember when the king of social network was called MySpace. And some of you have probably never heard about it. You might know about Facebook, but I predict going forward, Facebook will disappear. So in the online environment, we see very short business cycles where company emerges, dominate the sector and disappear. This is also something Google is confronted with. And that is the reason why they constantly need to reinvent themselves and take proactive steps to remain profitable for the benefit of the shareholder and employees. Now, the reason why I'm quite convinced that Google is fully aware of this problem is because some of the anti-competitive action they have taken actually fits perfectly into this pattern. Now, the first case I will tell you about is the Google Shopping, which outside of Europe normally is just called Google Search. Here, Google engaged in self-favoring, promoting its own services. It could be maps, it could be flights. In Europe, it was shopping. And in the Google Shopping case, the European Commission essentially identified two overlapping anti-competitive motives. The reason why Google tried to leverage its position into comparison shopping was because they want to monopolize a profitable service. That is a traditional monopolization strategy. But the second motive is very interesting because that's a defensive motive where Google essentially tried to protect the core service from a potential attack. You had some service who didn't offer a search engine, but they offered something that could develop into a search engine, and Google wanted to prevent them from doing that. That is the same defensive motive we saw in the old Microsoft case. Just for full information, when this case came to court, the first element was confirmed, but the court didn't confirm the second one, essentially because the commission never really invested a lot of energy into it. But it's interesting because it does prove that Google are acutely aware of the trouble that they're confronted and how the development of the market could essentially kill the business case. And you can really see it in the next case, that is the Google Android. Remember, the way you access the internet is changing, and the commission said, and that was confirmed on appeal, that the commission, so the reason why Google was so interested in essentially rolling out the Android system, they gave it away for free. And all of you who do not have an iPhone, you have an Android phone. And that means that you didn't get it for free, but the manufacturer get it for free. Sometimes they were even paid. And the only requirement Google had was that pre-installation of Google offering. So if you turn to your Android device, you will find a lot of Google offering. You would actually do the same if you turn to your iPhone. And that's because Google is paying billions of dollars to Apple to be the default option on iPhone. So Google saw this risk coming. They aggressively rolled out the Android, which we should be happy because that created competition to Apple. But at the same time, it also makes certain that they were the default option. So, even as you move to a mobile as the way of access to the internet, you would do it using a Google property, and thereby they would remain the gatekeeper. Now, let's become a little more legal. I have identified 110, potentially 111 cases. I have grouped them here. And of course, order is everything else. But what's interesting is that these 5 services essentially account for 62% of all of those cases I have. So 62% of all 110, potentially 111 cases pertain to one of these products or services. Now, there's a couple of things that is interesting before I'm going to tell you about the cases. The first thing is that everybody does a Google search case. Everybody does an Android case. What is interesting is everybody failed to identify anti-competitive behavior in the search, except from Turkey, Russia, and the European Commission. And the European Commission cheated because it is not a traditional search case. It's actually about malicious downgrading, at least in my opinion, because Google did not limit themselves to self-favoring. They also demoted competing offering. So it is easy to see what they have done that is unacceptable. But everybody has done a search case and everybody has failed. We can also see how almost everybody is doing an Android case, and a lot of them is pending, including here in Japan. It even looks like they take inspiration from each other. And that, of course, means that once agency have done a case and made a copy available in English, other takes inspiration. That makes sense. I also take inspiration from other colleagues. when they do a good paper, I might pick up a couple of ideas. So there's nothing wrong about that, but it is interesting. It's so much resources invested into search, even though everybody fails. So for some odd reason, everybody choose to run a case that others have failed to pursue. I think they probably do it because a lot of complaints are filed. Now, what is really interesting is not that there are so many cases, but two of them, the one everybody invests resources in, is essentially yesterday's problem. Google has won the browser war. The third browser war was essentially about making certain that Google remained the preferred option on a mobile phone. That is the Android case they wanted. There's no point of pursuing that case because, it was yesterday's abuse. And the self-favoring is the same. Google managed to leverage market position between services. So those two cases here is essentially something that was a problem a couple of years ago, which in terms of the internet is just like, the Middle Age or a million years ago. Now, those cases that really should keep the CEO of Google up at night and have the interest of the enforcer is actually the AdTech case and one of those down in others, because they pertain to something that's going to happen going forward, while the other one pertains something that was a problem a couple of years ago and where Google essentially has won the battle. Now I will try to explain why these cases should keep Google CEO up at night, why the enforcers should take an interest. I'm going to start with the AdTech case. Now, when we talk about online ads, we essentially have two kinds of online ads. We have what we call search ads and non-search ads. Search ads is mostly those you see through sponsored links when you do a search, but you can also go to a domain address and sometimes there will be searchable things. Display ads is you go to and could be a newspaper. They have a lot of display ads, and that is where the market is moving right now. And you can see here how display ad is actually outgrowing all other forms of online ads. I think one of the reasons for this is that people are more focused on privacy. Personally, I constantly delete cookies. I rely on several different browsers in order to mask me. And I even subscribe to some service that allows me to, be places where I'm not a VPN. So I take very proactive steps to hide who I am. Others probably don't care about it, but we see more and more agency and company who actually takes proactive steps to make it more complicated for them to harvest information. They don't really need that because I'm not that interested. What's much more interesting is what does people in Tokyo, based on a profile that they generate, what is our interest? What do we search for? So market is moving in the direction of display ads. Now, display ads is very much depending on an ad tech ecosystem where we have different parties. We have the publishers. The publishers are those who own an online site. That could be a newspaper, but it's also YouTube. YouTube is a publisher because they allow me to access video, and then they monetize the fact that I see a video by showing the ads. I'm cheating a bit because I've managed to download and install an ad blocker, but technically I have to see these ads. And at the same time, you have those who has a product, they want to run an ad. So normally in really old times, they would be talking to each other through an advertisement agency, but they don't really need that today to the same extent because there are different services, ad tech, that connects them. If you are the publisher, you can buy or rent a product or service that allows you to communicate with those who want to settle ads. And then in between, you have a stock exchange sort of clear the bids. This is the ad tech industry, and this is taken from the European Commission's investigation. Here you have the publisher. They rely on a publisher ad server. And over here, you had those who had a product they want to sell. They want to ad for it. They also add on a buying tool. And in between, you had the ad exchange. What is interesting is that Google dominates two of these services, at least in Europe. I don't know if the same is the case in Japan, but I would imagine that. So Google dominates this segment, and Google dominate that segment over here. They do not dominate the exchange. But the Commission's theory of harm is that Google is trying to leverage its market position also to dominate this. This is traditional monopolization strategy. And it makes commercial sense because, you know, the online display market is growing much faster than everything else. Now, here's also from the Commission's investigation, explained a little more in detail, and you can even see a couple of the products, so you can Google them, or you can ask people who are in the sector how these products are utilized. Now, I must underline that the European Commission has just started up, they did that last summer, an investigation, but they can actually rely on the French Competition Authority, who did a case that was a rendered decision in 2021. And somewhat unusual for the French Competition Authority, they actually published the decision in English. So even if you don't speak French, you can actually read the decision. And here you can not only get a really good introduction to the sector, but you can also see much more detailed what is that Google has done and why is it anti-competitive. Now, we don't know Google's position with respect to the investigation by the European Commission, and the same applies to all the other jurisdictions where an ad tech case is running. That is, of course, US and India. And I also believe that there's a case coming up in Australia. So we don't know legal defense of Google. You know, they might claim, or it might be correct that they haven't done it. We don't know that. We will have to see that forward. And we don't know fully what it is that they allegedly have done wrong. Now, in the French case, they have done two things. They have tried to, let's go back. They have tried to monopolize this. This is a typical foreclosure strategy, but much more interesting is that due to the fact that Google are in both ends and essentially is trading with itself, the French Competition Authority also concluded that Google had failed to provide the best price for the publisher and the advertisers. So they had, in principle, cheated the customers. This is very interesting because, you know, each victim has lost very few cents. You know, the loss for each of the customers are limited, but take into consideration how big this sector is, the compounded loss is gigantic. And that is reason why a number of class action is coming up. There is one in Germany, and they were advertising for victims. There's one in UK, and there has just been filed a claim in Holland. All of these three cases are based on the French decision, because the French decision says that the victim was all over Europe. I have checked it. It does not say anything about Japan and Asia, but I'm quite convinced that, you know, you probably have the same issue here. I have not checked the claim, but we are talking about several billion euro combined. So this is a really big class action coming up. And that should actually trouble the shareholder of Google, because if they lose the case, they will have to pay very handsomely. And at the same time, they might miss out on an opportunity to dominate a sector that is growing going forward. So this is the first case that should really trouble Google. And it's also the case that should have the attention of the enforcer. As you can see here, A lot of enforcers actually taking an interest into it. We got pending cases in EU, US, India, UK, and Australia. I haven't found any in Asia except from India. But we can see that a lot of agencies are also taking interest in those cases should not, because the real issue is here that is going forward. Now, the other case that should trouble Google is one of those down here, because what Google is doing is that in order to make the AI much better, they are scrapping data from all kinds of domain addresses. And let me try to explain this. Now, right now, AI are not very advanced. Here we have a colleague who made a quite interesting joke because he asked, is it possible to put pineapple on pizza? He's from Italy. And of course, in Italy, they got offended if you do that. And the AI said, yes, you can put the pineapple on your pizza. So therefore, it had to be banned in Italy. And I've seen some other example where the AI has produced results that obviously are wrong. So AI generated answer and communication are in the infancy. But once these issues are solved, we will have a much more advanced AI, and that will change the way we access the internet. Now, traditionally, you would do a search at the internet, and here, for instance, I have made a search for sugar cookies, and then I get some blue link, and then I will choose one of them, and that would take me to a page. Once again, it could be this, and here you would see ads. Now, as I explained shortly, Google are taking the information from these domain address, feeding it into AI, which essentially is scrapping. It potentially is intellectual property infringement, and I know that they hate it, but I have the feeling that they live with it because you do generate some traffic. But a bit of a trade-off. On one hand, they don't like the fact that Google are scrapping. On the other hand, they do appreciate the traffic that is sent to these domain addresses. Now, the problem is that going forward, that is going to change. Because rather than sending me to Wikipedia, Google actually provide the result directly. If I want to know the Prime Minister of Japan, I could go to Wikipedia, and they have the answer. But I can also just ask Google, and Google will actually scrap information from Wikipedia and other sources, and then they will provide it directly. And that means that business where you sort of, you were handing over some data, which you don't like, but then Google sends some traffic. That contract is being broken now because you no longer get this traffic. Now, this is in principle an intellectual property issue. And I know very little about intellectual property, but I understand that in most countries, the result generated up here would not be considered a protected work, and therefore there would most likely not be an infringement. In some countries, scrapping would be illegal. In other countries, it would not be. But my perception is that it has not really been easy for them to apply competition law, intellectual property law to stop that. In Europe, we have introduced some new laws that to some extent make it mandatory that they conclude a contract and pay for it. But of course, they are not helping, and they are not very accommodating in terms of negotiating. And as we move forward, they are scrapping all the data they want. So in US, a group of newspapers with a company called Helena, they have a very small, completely unknown newspaper online. They have filed a class action claiming that this is antitrust infringement. I cannot really make my head around if it is or it is not. I don't know anything about US, but I cannot decide if this is a case that could go forward in Europe. But if it cannot advance based on intellectual property, competition law could do it instead. Now, the reason why this is a case that should spook Google is because Google need to deal with the fact that Microsoft right now is leading the AI charts. Microsoft introduced ChatGPT, and as far as I understand, that is the most advanced AI we have right now. Now, if Google fail to respond to this with an AI that are more advanced, they could lose the ability to act as the gatekeeper to the internet. And that means that a business case could be destroyed. So this case could also challenge Google's ability to act as the gatekeeper going forward. And that is the reason why this is also a case that should really keep the CEO up and the shareholders spooked. And this is also a case that the Commission Authority around the world should take an interest into. I don't know to what extent they can succeed. I haven't really made up my mind regarding Europe, but it would be interesting to look into it. Now, yeah, a group of lawyers have attacked them, Now, I have relied on a lot of cases, and I've listed them here, including the American case. And all of this is much more detailed in my preliminary paper, where I have, more details and information about the different cases. My plan is to turn it into a real academic paper going forward. But it is published here, and you can just Google it. You can also send me an email, and I will be happy to send it to you. And I can also, because self-favoring is probably not as an independent infringement, so also allows to take some advertisement for my YouTube channel. I have 192 subscribers, so I'm very proud of that. So now I would be happy to take any questions.